So, I'm quite a big fan of Thomas the Tank Engine. However, Thomas isn't the only train show out there. There's others such as Chuggington, which I've done a full retrospective on. But then there's one other train show from my childhood I vaguely remember watching. And it's a show you probably all aren't that familiar with. It's a show called... Oh no! Oh no! Oh no! Oh my goodness! Jesus Christ! Burn it! Burn it with fire! Underground Ernie is one of the most bizarre drug trips of a TV show that I've ever seen. You thought Chuggington's animation was bad? Oh boy, you ain't seen nothing yet. Underground Ernie is one of the most disturbing children's shows I have ever watched in my entire life. Think Thomas and JJ the Jet Plane's love child being raised in the London Underground. Yeah, that's basically this show. It's one of those shows I vaguely remember watching when I was younger, and I would often think back to it and think, oh yeah, that was a nice show. But then when I actually went back and rewatched it, I thought to myself, Jesus Christ, what is this animation? What is this kid's show I remember watching? After rewatching Underground Ernie, I finally get what all those Mandela effect people are on about, because I feel like I've stepped into an alternate timeline where that charming little train show I used to watch when I was younger is in fact not charming and is instead one of the most creepiest things I've ever seen in my whole life. Like, this isn't some prank or something. No! This was an actual kid's show. Like, this was actually shown to children. Needless to say, there is a lot to talk about with Underground Ernie. So, what's the show about? Well, the show mainly focuses on a group of train characters who live and work in an underground railway, very heavily inspired by the real-life London Underground. Hell, even the logo of the show is just the logo of the London Underground. Not to mention all the characters' names actually come from real-life railway lines, such as Victoria, Bakerloo, Jubilee, and all the rest. It's actually quite an inspired show, and so today we are going to talk about that. It's a show that has mostly been forgotten by its fans, and it's very rare that you actually hear someone talk about it nowadays, since the show only ever had one series of 26 episodes, unlike say Thomas or Chuggington, where both those shows got loads of seasons, countless reboots, whereas Ernie more or less got forgotten about by its fans. But why was that? Why was it that those other two train shows are still well known to this day and are still celebrated by the fandom, while Underground Ernie is always forgotten about? Is it because the show only got one season? Or is it because it isn't as well known? Or is it because of the creepy animation? Yeah, it's probably that one, isn't it? Well, let's find out. And so with Chuggington seemingly having a resurgence in the Thomas fandom in recent years, I thought it might be a good idea to look back on another animated train show from my childhood. But don't worry, I won't be suffering alone, as usual bloke Luke and Play Don't Pause will be doing a watch along with me, where we watched one of the episodes from Underground Ernie. And throughout the video I will be inserting clips from our little watch along.
Oh no! God almighty!
So, with all that out of the way, mind the gap and don't be nervous. I feel nervous, Ernie! As we take a look back at the Underground's forgotten show, Underground Ernie. Let's begin. Underground Ernie was created by John Deary and Sid Rainey. During a brainstorming session, Sid suggested the idea of a train show with characters' names based on the London Underground tube stations. You know, that smelly, homeless-dwelling, rat-infested cesspool of a railway network? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea for a kid's show. For the production of the show, John and Sid formed the company Joella Productions in the year 2000, with the name Joe coming from John's son's name, and the Ella part coming from Sid's daughter's name. Huh, quite fitting that this children's entertainment company would have its names come from the founders' children. Interesting. While Joella was the production company, the animation was actually done by a company called 3D Films. Oh, very original name there, guys. Yes, they were responsible for this creepy as hell animation that we see in the show. Though, to be fair, this was the early 2000s, so on some level you can kind of forgive parts of the animation. Still, it doesn't make it look good though. Apparently Joella Productions and 3D Films had a very strained relationship. It's unclear as to why, but behind the scenes drama is usually a very common thing in CGI animated productions, and the end product definitely shows that. Sid Rainey teamed up with writer and script editor Jan Page to create characters, ideas, and scripts for the show. Jan would write 8 episodes for Underground Ernie. Also, hey, she would later write some of the classic Thomas stories such as Emily's New Coaches, Toby's Windmill, Fergus Breaks the Rules, and 3 Cheers for Thomas. Jan wrote some of the better Series 7 Thomas episodes, I think, and the same is also also true for Underground Ernie. A lot of her plots definitely feel like they could have been in classic Thomas, so that's interesting. Also, does anyone else find it ironic that she's a script editor called Jan Page? What's next? Andrew Paper? Although Jan wasn't the only Thomas writer, there was also Louise Kromowski, who wrote 4 episodes for Underground Ernie, and would go on to write such amazing Thomas episodes as Thomas and the Runaway Kite, Toby and the Whistling Wood, and Toby's New Whistle.
Oh no!
She also wrote an episode in Underground Ernie called The Magic Lamp, not to be confused with the Thomas episode of The Magic Lamp, which she did not write, but anyway. And then we have Ross Hastings, who wrote 4 episodes of Underground Ernie, and would also go on to be a writer for Thomas. Those episodes being Buffer Bother, Thomas the Jet Engine, and Faulty Whistles. In fact, Headmaster Hastings' name would actually come from Ross Hastings. Interesting. And we also have Diane Redmond, who wrote 8 episodes for Underground Ernie, but unlike the last writers listed, she did not work on Thomas. And finally, we have Lisa Achus, who wrote only 2 episodes for the series and also did not write for Thomas. Something that should be noted about Underground Ernie is that the vast majority of the show was actually written by female writers. In fact, of the 26 episodes written, only 4 were written by a guy, which were Ross Hastings episodes. Not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, just an interesting observation that I made while watching the show. So, considering we got 2 classic series writers from Thomas, 1 Nitrogen era writer, and 2 completely original writers, I think that gives you a pretty good idea of what Underground Ernie's plots are like. So, as I said, the show was inspired by the real-life London Underground. So each train's name comes from a particular railway line in London that they worked on, such as Victoria, whose name comes from the Victoria Line, or Bakerloo, after the Bakerloo Line, Circle, after the Circle Line, and a bunch of others which I'll get into in a minute. And I must say, Sid's idea to personify the London Underground into actual characters is honestly such an inspired idea. That inspired idea is something that I really respect about Underground Ernie. In that regard, I think it has a lot more in common with Thomas's origins than other train shows, and I'll get more into this later. Hell, even the logo for Underground Ernie is the exact same logo seen on the London Underground. Also, fun fact about that, TfL, or Transport for London, actually gave the show permission to use the London Underground logo for its show, as noted in the credits of the show, which I think is pretty cool. In fact, Transport for London allowed the show to use a lot of their trademarked iconography, like the maps of the railway network that's used in the show, albeit with some significant creative liberties, or the logo for the show, which can even be seen on Ernie himself, and hell, even all the trains got their own individual logos, like Bakerloo got a logo with a magnifying glass, Victoria got one with a crown, Jubilee got one with a J on it, Circle got one with a flower, and Hammersmith and City even got their own logos too. Even down to the tiles in the London Underground being different from tunnel to tunnel. As a young kid who was a fan of railways, I always thought it was really cool that these shows felt really inspired by real life railways and actual things that you could see in the London Underground. In a lot of ways, Underground Ernie was like a modern day Thomas the Tank Engine, in a similar way to how Thomas was the personification of real steam engines for young boys in the 1960s. Underground Ernie was kinda like a modern day personification of real railway networks for kids growing up in the early 2000s. I really appreciate that Transport for London allowed them to use all their trademarked iconography because it just gives the show an extra sense of authenticity. So in that regard, I really like the show. For the voice cast, Ernie himself was voiced by Gary Lineker, the well-known English footballer and commentator. I think Gary gives Ernie a very nice, humble English accent.
Hello, Millie.
What did you do this weekend?
I fixed a puncture on my bike.
There's other cast members, of course, but the main one you Thomas fans will probably all know is Tim Whitnell. Sometimes you'll hear Timothy.
Morning, everyone. What's the matter?
Other times you'll hear Reg.
Everyone is going to watch the football, Bakerloo.
And other times you'll hear Stingo, if anyone here even knows who that is.
Oh, it's all right, Circle.
So it is kind of funny hearing Tim Whitnell in this show. The show itself was produced between October 2001 to December of 2003 and was set to be released in the summer of 2005. However, after the unfortunate July 7 attacks in London in 2005, which was affected by the London Underground, the show was actually pushed back a year to 2006 as to not be insensitive to those events, which I actually think was a pretty smart decision on the BBC's part. And with that, Underground Ernie finally came out. So, with the production history out of the way, let's move on to the show itself, starting with the cast. So, what is Underground Ernie, other than a fever dream? Well, like I said, the show is a personification of the London Underground. Only instead of being called that, it's called International Underground. Oh, don't you worry, we'll get to all those international characters soon. Now, there are 5 main trains in the series, or technically 6 depending on Hammersmith and City, who run the International Underground. But before we talk about them, I think we need to talk about the human characters, since the show is named after Ernie after all. And oh my god. Yes, the human animation in this show is abhorrent. Possibly the creepiest part of the entire show is its humans, if you can even call them humans. They always do these weird close-ups and head-on stares into the camera, like they're looking into my soul. They're very disturbing, very out of proportion, and just all-around creepy. Just the way they're animated, they're so freaky. Ernie's model feels less like something you'd see in a kid's show, and more like something you'd see at the foot of your bed at 4 in the morning. But who are these humans? Well, there's 3 main humans in the show. Ernie himself, Millie, the female lead who works in the control tower, and Mr. Rails, who's the maintenance man of the railway. Now, Ernie is an interesting character. Unlike the Fat Controller, who feels more like a strict father figure to the engines, Ernie feels less like a strict dad and more like a fun uncle. Ernie is a very fun character.
All is magic.
And most of that definitely comes from his voice actor, Gary. He'll often joke around with Millie.
I've just had this idea for a little joke.
Careful, Ernie. You know what happens when you play jokes.
And he's always up for a laugh with the trains, although his jokes can go a little too far, like the time he pretended to be a skeleton to fright away Victoria. Yeah, maybe that joke went a little too far, Ernie, but other than that, he is a pretty fun character. Also, Ernie got a job working in the London Underground when he has a fear of the dark.
These tunnels can be a bit dark, and between you and me, Fred, I don't much like the dark.
Why would you get a job in the London Underground then if you've a fear of the dark, Ernie? And then there's Millie. Not too much to say about her. She's just the female lead who runs the International Underground. She sort of represents the female workers of the London Underground, which I think is nice. But I don't have too much to say about her, other than she is also creepy, but I think that goes for every character in this show. And finally, we have Mr. Rails, who is the mechanic of the railway, and is quite the comedic foil throughout the series. His catchphrase being, Mr. Rails never fails,
Mr. Rails never fails.
despite the fact he constantly fails throughout the whole series. But whatever. He is definitely one of the funnier characters in the series. I do like Mr. Rails quite a lot. Out of all the humans, he definitely feels like the most real character, especially in the episode where he discovers the treasure. But what was great about that scene was Mr. Rails says that he wants to retire.
I can retire at last.
Sorry, Mr. Rails, but this treasure belongs to the museum.
Does that mean it'll have to go back?
Of course it does.
Oh, just my luck.
I just thought that was really cool, like a nice bit of characterization there, and it felt realistic. I really like that. Like the fact the show is actually named after a human rather than some random train character is pretty novel. It's like if Thomas and Friends was called Topham Hatt's Trains or something. Speaking of which, who are the trains? Well, as the song says, there's Victoria. So Victoria is kind of like the old, posh English woman character.
Whatever is the matter, Mr. Rails? I'm in a hurry.
She has this super creepy pinkish face and also has glasses and a tiara. Them being creepy kind of applies to all of them, but anyway. And as I said, Victoria's name comes from the real-life Victoria line in London. And out of all the main characters, I think she's one of the cleverest personifications of her line, with her character coming from the late Queen Victoria. Hell, even adorning one of Queen Victoria's favourite tiaras. She also has a very upper-class British accent.
I am not having closed stations on my line.
Her whole design and her whole demeanour makes the show feel very distinctly British, if that makes sense. And she's also one of the oldest characters on the Underground too. Although I do find it slightly odd that they made her one of the older characters, since on the Underground, in real life, the Victoria line was actually one of the newer lines, but I digress. And then we have Baker Lou, who I think might be my favourite character in the entire show.
I've read that dinosaurs are not really extinct. extinct.
It wasn't until rewatching the series that I realized how much of a fun character Bakerloo is.
Genies are magical creatures that live in ancient lamps.
Much like Victoria, Bakerloo is also a really good personification of his line. He's essentially Sherlock Holmes as a train, which is such a fun character trait. He even has this monocle and a signature Sherlock Holmes hat. This is really clever because the real-life Bakerloo line actually stops at Baker Street, which, as you all may or may not know, is the home of Sherlock Holmes. Much like Victoria, he is a very clever personification of not just his line, but also of a famous London person. So in that regard, I think he's really cool. Though, despite being a Sherlock Holmes type, ironically enough, he is still a bit stupid. And will only jump in and say that he's right after the fact.
I knew it was a hologram all along. I suspected that sound was in fact a didgeridoo. He thought it was magic. I had my doubts, of course. I didn't take any notice of it myself.
Bakerloo is easily the best character in the show. He's constantly looking for mysteries to solve. He believes in all these old legends of the London Underground and is an absolute conspiracy theorist. And then we have Jubilee, who is basically Tim Whitnell the train.
Not quite now, Ernie. I'm not looking cool enough.
Jubilee is the youngest of the trains in the series, which I actually really like, since in real life, the Jubilee line was also one of the newest lines on the Tube network. Also, his silver paintwork comes from the real colour of that railway line, which I think is pretty cool. Another thing I like about Jubilee is how much of a simpleton he can be at times. He's a bit stupid.
Good for the Constitution.
Huh? Dinosaur is not real!
Just turn it off then.
Just turn the fucking thing off. When you see people running for their lives about, turn the fucking thing off, you simpleton.
But I also have a lot of questions about Jubilee. So apparently he's really tech savvy. Like, it's said on multiple occasions that he uses the internet.
How? I've been following that match on the internet.
Like, how? He's a train.
And we can get Jubilee to mention it on the Underground website.
Again, how? He's a train. He also plays a lot of PC games.
I've just been playing my new monster computer game. Anyone want to play my monster computer game with me?
No!
How does he play computer games and surf the net?
I made it on my computer, and I think you'll agree it's just what you're looking for.
How did you make this on your computer, Jubilee? You are a train. He's very much a cool teenager character and will often say words like cool and wicked.
It's cool. It's wiki!
And that's pretty much all of the good characters in this series. Yeah, no offense to Circle, Hammersmith or City, but I'm not particularly big fans of them. So Circle is the green train, and oh my goodness, she looks absolutely hideous. Again, I know that applies to a lot of characters in the series, but particularly her. She's like this weird hybrid of Percy, Daisy, and a diseased caterpillar. She also has the most annoying voice out of everyone, in my opinion.
Hey, slow down! Not so fast!
Now, for the most part, I think the voice acting is pretty good in this series, but for some reason, despite Circle being the token girl character, they had her voiced by a man doing a terrible girl impression.
Ernie's entering a competition too, you know.
Why? It's not like you didn't have other female cast members to voice her. Like, both Victoria and Millie were voiced by two separate females. Why did you get a man to do a terrible girl impression, especially when you already had female cast members? Not that I'm against that, like Keith Wickham can do a very good Dowager hat, but Circle just sounds so bad. Thanks, Chris. Oh, Chris Jarvis. Never mind, scratch that. She's now the best character. Now, I don't completely hate her, if I'm being honest. Like, she does actually have a character. She has this pretty chilled out personality compared to the other characters.
I've just been to Seashell Bay. It's so beautiful.
Like, she's a very relaxed train and she talks very slowly, which I actually quite like. She also has this catchphrase, relax on your tracks.
You should relax on your tracks.
Which, last time I checked, was not a very good idea. But I guess she's not a bad character, because at least she actually has a character, which is more than I can say for Hammersmith and City. Yeah, there really isn't too much to say about these two. Like, Hammersmith is the one with the purple roof and blue glasses, while City is the one with the mustard roof and the purple glasses. And no, I have no idea why they look like the comedian Alan Carr. I do think it's clever that they made the twin engines be based off the Hammersmith and City line, since, you know, they're Hammersmith and City. Granted, they do have some personality traits, like being super into football.
2, 4, 6, 8. Which team do
we think he's great.
In fact, there's a whole episode where one of them supports the red team while the other supports the blue team.
The Reds! The Blues!
Wait a minute, I've seen this plot before.
And then there was trouble.
And that's pretty much all of the main cast of Engines. Oh, but don't you worry, there are plenty of diverse characters in the mix. And by diverse, I mean incredibly racist and insensitive. So the first stereotype, international character, is Sydney from Australia.
I'll be at International Underground any moment.
Whose name comes from, well, the real-life Australian city of Sydney. And also, she brings passengers all the way from Australia.
She's bringing some tourists all the way from Australia.
How? How the hell does Sydney bring passengers all the way from Australia?
Have a safe trip back to Australia.
Will do.
She seriously travelled all the way to England by rail. Are they seriously implying that there's an underground tunnel going all the way from Australia to Asia? I mean, Jesus, they barely made the Channel Tunnel from France to England. Never mind Australia. Huh, this really is the International Railway since it's literally on 5 different continents. Speaking of which, we also have a Russian train, and he's not just Russian because he's going really fast. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, I'll be here all night. Nah, but seriously, there is a Russian train called Moscow who is from, well, Moscow. And you can tell that he's the Russian train because of the giant Joseph Stalin mustache on the front of him. While also quite offensive, I'm just thankful they didn't do a certain German train.
The Russians are coming.
Suka bliet, Moscow. Suka bliet indeed. But don't worry, it's not just the Russians we're offending. We also have Brooklyn. Now, this might surprise you all, but Brooklyn, believe it or not, comes from America. You can tell this by the giant Star-Spangled Banner on his side, not to mention the Statue of Liberty, USA in bold capitals, and a giant blue and white star baseball cap. Yeah, totally not stereotypical, guys. And much like Sydney, where she is somehow able to go all the way from Australia to England, Brooklyn is also somehow able to go all the way from America to England.
Come on, champ. Time to go home.
Like, how? I don't know, it's never really explained. I guess in this universe they just have tunnels going under the oceans, I guess. And then we have Osaka, who is... Oh no! Oh no!
You can access the net and send video messages.
What? Now, Osaka is the Japanese train. Whoa, never would I guess that, especially with the rising sun bandana on his top. So, fun fact, Osaka's episode was actually the one that I showed to Usual Bloke Luke and played on pause. For no particular reason, I'm sure.
Oh no. God almighty. He's racist.
So, this is Osaka. Man, what is it with these talking train shows and Japanese characters? I guess the Japanese just really love its talking trains, but I don't know. Now, as I said, Osaka is the Japanese speed train who brings the latest technology from Japan.
There are gifts from Japan for you in my cabin.
This latest technology includes a 2006 Nokia Blockia phone.
The latest WAP phone.
Wow, really living in the future, guys. And he also brings over a hologram machine. The projector also does whatever the hell this is, which proceeds to project a fucking goddamn dinosaur into the middle of the London Underground. You know, Nokia phones and giant goddamn dinosaurs. The usual technology.
This is a fucking nightmare.
Dude, I am having a fever dream. Why did the ground shake?
And they also make this reference too.
Help us, Jubilee. You are our only hope.
I'm sorry, what? Was that a Star Wars A New Hope reference in Underground Ernie? Am I having a stroke right about now? Keep in mind that this show came out in 2006. How the hell was this approved? How did they look at Osaka and think, ah yes, this is perfectly fine to show to children? Like what? Now, while Osaka, Moscow, and all the other international characters are incredibly stereotypical, I don't think I would necessarily call it racist, since racist sort of implies that they were intentionally trying to be stereotypical with these countries, which I don't think was the case here. I think the crew were genuinely trying to show other countries and cultures around the world. Like, I don't think this came from a place of malice against these countries or anything. I just think their execution was absolutely horrific. While these characters are incredibly stereotypical and borderline racist, to be fair on the show, it does also show its fair share of English stereotypes too, like how there's a literal Queen train character called called Victoria, or how there's a Sherlock Holmes train. So it's not like they're singling out any particular culture here. Can't be racist if you stereotype everyone, right? Oh yeah, speaking of which, I'm really looking forward to Series 2 when they introduce Paddy Wagon, along with his friends Lewis and Dart. Like I said, I don't think the crew had any intentions of intentionally being racist or anything. Like, all they wanted to do was represent other trains around the world. It's just the way they went about it was very dated, and would absolutely not fly today. In fact, Ernie's voice actor Gary Lineker even supports this, where he used Osaka as a positive example of international characters. Maybe not the best example there, Gary. Now, there are other characters in the series like Dr. Hart, haha, get it, and a pop star called Sam Seven, but I'm not really bothered covering all of them. So, now that we've gone through all of the cast, let's move on to the episodes that they star in. So, Underground Ernie, as the name implies, is a TV show all about Ernie and his job in the inner workings of a huge metropolitan railway network. And despite the show being called Underground Ernie, for some reason 70% of the show is not underground. Hell, even Hammersmith and City have a line that goes directly onto a roller coaster ride. Yeah, my favourite part of the London Underground is when it goes into a roller coaster. Although, to be fair on Ernie, only 45% of the real London Underground is actually underground. So, I guess it is kind of true to real life. And also, I do think it was a smart decision to not have the whole show take place underground, if that makes sense. Because we get so much more diversity with the sets and locations, so I do think it was a smart decision. Now, you can knock Underground Ernie for a lot of things, from the weird animation, to the questionable characters, to the voice acting, or even the editing. But one thing you can't question about this show is the scripts. Now, how the episodes are edited or animated is a whole other beast altogether, and I will try to get into that later, but you can't deny the scripts are actually pretty good.
How are all your patients today, Dr. Hart?
Oh, very well, considering they're ill, Victoria.
Now, as scripts go, they are pretty standard, but I don't think there's a single bad one in here. There's so many wonderful interactions we get between the characters. Again, I think my favourites have to be whenever Victoria or Bakerloo talk, since they bounce off each other really well.
It may now be here on your line.
Don't be ridiculous.
The interactions with all the other characters feel particularly unique. Like, the trains don't feel like they're being written generically. No, all the characters always feel like they have different perspectives and thoughts about a given situation. Even characters I don't care for, like Circle, feel like they have character. I think all the characters are used quite effectively in the plots they're in. And considering the plot of the show is just trains in the underground, I think it's impressive that they managed to get so many plots as they did out of this show. Like, these episodes do feel like that they were written by professional writers, but I just think the show is mainly let down in its editing. And now, I know I'm not perfect at editing myself, but oh my god, some of the editing in this show is absolutely horrific. Specifically the transitions in the show. Like, look at this scene for a second.
Morning, Ernie.
Hello, Millie.
So it cuts to a tunnel, then a random fade in and out of black, then a 1 second establishing shot, then a circle fade into a monitor, before fading to Millie. Like, could you have not held onto one of these shots for more than a second? And why did you use every transition known to man? This isn't the only time this weird editing transition cue shows up too, by the way. There are plenty of weird fades, random cuts to black, and all with zero thoughts for pacing. Okay, like, I wasn't expecting Better Call Saul levels of editing here or anything, but just holding on a scene for more than 1 second would have been nice. Speaking of weird transitions, sometimes they'll have this random guy sing Ernie in the background of a given transition.
Oh, what a day.
What?
It's very random, and once you notice it, you can never unnotice it, if that makes sense.
Job.
Shut up already about Ernie! It's so random when you're trying to watch an episode and then you just randomly hear Ernie in the background, and we're meant to just accept it like it isn't the most creepiest thing ever.
What the hell was that? I'm gonna singing.
Some random. But could you imagine if Thomas left Farquhar and went to some other station and just Thomas? Who is singing that exactly? Is it you, Sam 7? Also, why are you called Sam 7 when there's only one of you? Are there 6 other Sams we just haven't met yet? Speaking of sound, some of the sound effects in this show are pretty unintentionally funny at times. For example, the shed door opening sound effects sound like the crates opening from Minecraft, I think.
Easy.
Which is pretty funny. For this scene here, instead of having an applause sound effect, they just use this really sarcastic clapping noise.
Wow!
So, now you've had a...
Why did you use that really sarcastic clap instead of a proper applause noise?
Wow!
So,
Wow!
so...
Although, I don't hate all the sound effects in the show. In fact, there are some sound effects here that I think Ernie does a better job of than Thomas and Chuggington. It's the sound that the engines make when they're going along the line. And it's so satisfying to listen to. Also, for some reason, Ernie's little rail speeder makes this Roadrunner meep meep sounds whenever it stops. Beep beep. Like, why would it make that noise? Oh, because it's a speeder. I get it. There's also this random farting balloon. Why? Why? It's just so random. The episode ends.
Good night.
And then it just fades to this random farting balloon before the cut to credits. Why? Who was making this decision? Also, speaking of which, this random ending gag wasn't exclusive to this episode either. No, for some reason, every episode of this show ends with some random non-canon joke. What the hell was that? Or when Mr. Rails pulls a rabbit out of his hat and it makes a cow sound effect? Why? Why, Underground Ernie? Why? Wait, why did that happen again? Huh? What? Wait, what was this? Why did they leave this in? Why? Oh my god, this show, I can't. Every time you finish an episode of Underground Ernie, you just get the most random non-canon thing ever, which just leaves you there kind of going, huh? There's one where it's implied that a ball can come to life. Like, are balls also sentient in this universe like the train? Does Ernie have sentient balls? All these random gags just feel like the animator's fucking around. And I guess they just left them in the show at the end as a gag. And on that note, I think I've said plenty about the structure of these episodes. Now, let's move on to the next segment. Shut up already about Ernie! Why was Underground Ernie not as successful compared to Thomas, or hell, even Chuggington? Unlike those shows, where they got loads of reboots and had many fans all over the world, Ernie is more or less forgotten about by its fans. But why was that? Well, there's a few reasons, I think. Firstly, the animation is creepy as hell, but like most TV shows, the animation of the first season usually isn't the best, and perhaps if Underground Ernie had gotten more episodes, perhaps the animation would have improved over time. I mean, keep in mind, this was made around 2002, so I think on some level you can kind of excuse it. But secondly, I think what mainly killed the show was the fact it only ever got one season. There was allegedly a series 2 of Ernie planned, but due to the fraught relationship between Joella Productions and 3D Films, this next series never came to be. I was actually surprised to learn this. I was sure that there was at least 2 seasons of the show. Hell, even Busy Buses got a second season. I do often wonder what it would have been like had Ernie gotten a second season of the show. Like, as I said, series 1 of most TV shows usually is the worst one of the series. It's the one where they're still figuring out the kinks of the show and trying to figure out how the characters work. But because Ernie only ever got one season, this cursed abomination is all the show is ever remembered as. Like, think back to some of your favorite shows like The Simpsons or Bob the Builder. Very rough around the edges in their first few seasons, but a second or third season helps straighten out those kinks. And considering how far CGI animation has come in such a short amount of time, and considering this show was made in 2002, when phones still looked like this, and the show was in a 4.3 aspect ratio, I think it's a big shame that we never got to see the crew on Ernie improve upon their craft. Because for what the show was, the scripts were pretty good, the characters were pretty interesting, and I liked that the show was focused more on the human element, and the fact it was based on a real railway was just the icing on the cake. And while it didn't do too well in the foreign markets, it was actually one of the most viewed and successful shows to ever air on CBeebies in the UK. So for the short time time it was on the air, it did well, really well in fact. Had the show just been made 4 or 5 years later after it was, the animation would have been so much better, and perhaps it would have been more fondly remembered by people. Considering this was made in 2002 and was aired in 2006, surely by the time the crew got around to a Series 2, surely the animation quality would have improved drastically, right? Not perfectly, but it would have looked better than Series 1, I think. But all of this is just wishful thinking. As it stands, Underground Ernie is, and will always be, just remembered as that weird-ass train show that is not Thomas, and has the freaky animation. Hell, we're at that point now where the show has already been forgotten. Its will and testament has already been read. The future of Underground Ernie is now, and it's all been but forgotten about. But remember guys, we are a Thomas the Tank Engine fandom. We thrive on train content, especially cringy weird train content. So, the next time you're bored of Thomas and you're on Discord with your pals looking for something to watch, why not stick on an episode of Underground Ernie? Trust me, you won't regret it.
Oh no! God almighty!
Well, maybe you will regret it, but I digress. So yeah, that was Underground Ernie. A very cursed and bizarre show. It's honestly kind of easy to take the piss out of it, and I'm surprised more Thomas YouTubers haven't covered the show, as it's such an easy show to make fun of, guys. Seriously, I barely only tapped the surface with this one. There is so much more unexplored weirdness in the show to find. It is the definition of a show that you remember differently from when you were younger versus when you're older. While the show isn't exactly a high art, it definitely has its charm. Charm being a word I've been trying very hard to avoid this whole video, but it does have its charm. While it's very much a byproduct of its time that absolutely wouldn't be made today, I think that's kind of the charm of the show. It's almost like a time capsule for what children's media was like back in the very early 2000s. It's unlike other train shows of its genre, where being a train is actually important to the plot of the show. The fact that all the characters are named after real railway lines and real train stations is pretty cool. I like that it took inspiration from real railway networks. And in a weird way, it is actually kind of in line with Audrey's philosophy of how personification of engines work. To finish up on this video, I'm going to end on a quote from Wilbert Audrey.
And electrics, especially the London Underground, they're rather like worms. They live in holes, and you've got the feeling that, like a worm, you could cut it in half and it wouldn't mind. It'll grow a separate end each way.
Thank you all for watching, and a major shout out to my Patrons who made this video possible. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I will catch you all in the next one. Slán Bhaile.